The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning in downtown San Diego. Judge Margaret Reynolds looked down from her bench with her usual stern expression. She had been a judge for 15 years and thought she had seen everything. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her black robes made her look even more serious than usual. In the defendant's chair sat a man who looked completely out of place. He was about 60 years old with silver hair and deep blue eyes. His clothes were simple, just a plain white shirt and dark pants. Nothing fancy or expensive. He sat quietly with his hands folded, looking calm despite being in court. The man was there because of a parking ticket. A simple parking ticket that had turned into something bigger. He had parked his old pickup truck in front of a government building 3 weeks ago. The parking meter had expired while he was inside, and when he came out, there was a bright orange ticket under his windshield wiper. Most people would have just paid the $50 fine and moved on with their lives. But this man was different. He believed the ticket was unfair because the parking meter was broken. The little red light that was supposed to show when time was running out wasn't working. How could he know his time was up if the meter didn't tell him? So he decided to fight the ticket in court. He filled out the paperwork himself and requested a hearing. He didn't hire a lawyer because he thought the case was simple enough. Either the meter was working or it wasn't. He had even taken pictures of the broken meter with his phone to prove his point. Judge Reynolds looked at the case file in front of her. "Mr. James Patterson," she called out, reading from the papers. "You're here to contest a parking violation. Is that correct?" The man stood up slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, that's correct." The judge looked him up and down with a slight frown. She had dealt with hundreds of people trying to get out of parking tickets over the years. Most of them had silly excuses that wasted everyone's time. She assumed this would be just another one of those cases. "Mr. Patterson, do you have a lawyer representing you today?" she asked. "No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself." Judge Reynolds shook her head slightly. People who represented themselves in court usually made things much more complicated than they needed to be. They didn't understand the law and often said things that hurt their own cases. "Very well," she said with a sigh. "Let's get this over with. What's your excuse for not paying your parking ticket?" The way she said excuse made it clear that she didn't think much of whatever he was about to say. Her tone was dismissive, like she was already bored before he even started talking. Mr. Patterson remained calm despite her attitude. "Your Honor, the parking meter was malfunctioning. The indicator light that shows when time is running out was not working properly. I have photographs that clearly show this." He pulled out his phone and walked toward the bench, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand to stop him. "Mr. Patterson, let me save you some time," she said with a slight smile that wasn't friendly at all. "I've heard every parking meter excuse in the book. Broken meters, quarters that got stuck, clocks that were wrong. Do you really think you're the first person to claim a meter was broken?" The people in the courtroom started to murmur quietly. Some of them were there for their own cases, and others were just watching because they had nothing better to do. They could tell the judge wasn't taking Mr. Patterson seriously. "Your Honor, I understand that people make excuses," Mr. Patterson replied respectfully, "but I'm not making an excuse. I'm presenting evidence of a genuine equipment failure." Judge Reynolds laughed a little. "Evidence? Mr. Patterson, you're making this sound like a major criminal case. It's a parking ticket. $50. Just pay it and move on with your life." She looked around the courtroom as if she was performing for the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of time wasting that clogs up our court system. People who think they're above the law and don't want to pay a simple fine." Mr. Patterson's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He had spent his whole life serving others and following rules. Being accused of thinking he was above the law was particularly insulting, even though he didn't show it. "Your Honor, I've never considered myself above the law," he said quietly. "I simply believe that if equipment is broken, it's unfair to punish people for not knowing about it." "Oh, please," Judge Reynolds said, rolling her eyes. "Next, you'll probably tell me you're some kind of important person who shouldn't have to deal with parking tickets like the rest of us regular folks." The courtroom got very quiet. Even the people who had been whispering stopped talking. There was something about the way Mr. Patterson stood there, taking the insults without getting angry, that made everyone pay attention. But Judge Reynolds was just getting started. She was having what she thought was fun with this stubborn old man who wouldn't just pay his ticket and leave. "Let me guess, Mr. Patterson," she continued with a mocking tone. "You probably think you deserve special treatment because you're a veteran or something. Well, let me tell you something. I don't care if you served in the military or not. Everyone follows the same rules in my courtroom. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mr. Patterson stood perfectly still, his hands still folded in front of him. He had been insulted, dismissed, and mocked, but he hadn't said a word in his own defense about who he really was. What Judge Reynolds didn't know was that sitting quietly in the back row of her courtroom was someone who knew exactly who James Patterson was. Admiral Robert Mitchell had come to court that day for a completely different case, but when he heard the name being called, he couldn't believe his ears. Admiral Mitchell watched in growing amazement as Judge Reynolds continued to mock and dismiss the man at the defendant's table. If she only knew who she was talking to, she would understand just how wrong she was about everything she was saying. Admiral Robert Mitchell sat in the back of the courtroom, barely believing what he was witnessing. He had known James Patterson for over 20 years, and watching him being treated this way made his blood boil. But he also knew Patterson well enough to understand why the man wasn't defending himself or revealing who he really was. Judge Reynolds was still enjoying herself at the defendant's expense. She leaned back in her chair and looked down at Mr. Patterson like he was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. "You know what I think, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I think you're one of those people who watches too much TV and thinks every little traffic violation is some kind of conspiracy against you. You probably think the whole world owes you something." Mr. Patterson remained silent, which only seemed to encourage the judge to continue her verbal assault. "I bet you're retired and have nothing better to do than waste the court's time with your silly theories about broken parking meters," she went on. "Maybe you should find a hobby instead of bothering hardworking public servants with your complaints." The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Chen, looked uncomfortable. She had expected this to be a simple case where the defendant would either pay the fine or provide some evidence about the meter. Instead, it had turned into a one-sided attack by the judge. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said hesitantly, "perhaps we should look at the evidence Mr. Patterson mentioned." Judge Reynolds waved her hand dismissively. "Ms. Chen, don't encourage him. If we looked at everyone's so-called evidence about parking meters, we'd be here all day. The meter was working fine. If it wasn't, the city would have fixed it." Mr. Patterson finally spoke up again. "Your Honor, I have maintenance records showing that this particular meter had been reported as malfunctioning multiple times before my citation." "Maintenance records?" Judge Reynolds laughed. "Where did you get those? Did you file a Freedom of Information Act request for a parking ticket?" "Mr. Patterson, you're taking this way too seriously." What the judge didn't know was that Mr. Patterson had indeed filed the proper requests to get those records. It wasn't because he cared about $50. He could easily afford the fine. It was because he believed in fairness and doing things the right way. These were values that had guided him throughout his entire career. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson said patiently, "I believe that government equipment should work properly if people are expected to follow the rules. If a parking meter can't tell someone when their time is up, how can they be fairly penalized?" "Oh, spare me the civics lesson," Judge Reynolds replied. "You're not some constitutional scholar, Mr. Patterson. You're just another person trying to get out of paying a fine." Admiral Mitchell had heard enough. He could see that Patterson wasn't going to defend himself, even though he was being humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. That was just the kind of man Patterson was. He never used his position or reputation to get special treatment, but watching a respected hero being mocked by someone who had no idea what she was doing was more than the Admiral could bear. He stood up from his seat in the back row, his movement causing several people to turn and look. Judge Reynolds noticed the disturbance and looked toward the back of the courtroom with annoyance. "Sir, please sit down. We're in the middle of proceedings here." Admiral Mitchell was wearing civilian clothes, but everything about the way he carried himself screamed military. He was tall and broad-shouldered with steel gray hair and the kind of bearing that came from decades of commanding respect. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption," he said in a clear, strong voice that carried easily through the courtroom, "but I feel I need to speak." "Well, you can't," Judge Reynolds snapped. "This isn't your case, and you have no business interrupting. Sit down or I'll have you removed from my courtroom." Admiral Mitchell didn't sit down. Instead, he took a step forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think you should know who you're talking to." Judge Reynolds was getting angry now. First, she had to deal with a stubborn defendant who wouldn't just pay his ticket. and now some stranger was trying to interrupt her proceedings. "I don't care who he is," she said loudly. "He could be the President of the United States for all I care. In my courtroom, everyone gets treated the same way." The irony of her words would become clear very soon. But at that moment, Judge Reynolds was too angry to realize what she had just said. "Sit down right now, or I'll hold you in contempt of court," she warned the Admiral. Admiral Mitchell looked at Mr. Patterson, who gave him the slightest shake of his head. Patterson still didn't want special treatment even now. He was willing to let the judge continue making a fool of herself, rather than use his reputation to win a case. But Admiral Mitchell had made his decision. Some things were more important than one man's modesty. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "I am Admiral Robert Mitchell of the United States Navy, and I cannot sit here and watch you disrespect one of the finest Americans I have ever had the honor to know." The courtroom went completely silent. Even Judge Reynolds stopped talking, though she didn't look impressed by the Admiral's introduction. "I don't care if you're an admiral or a janitor," she said, though her voice was a little less confident than before. "You have no right to interrupt these proceedings." Admiral Mitchell smiled grimly. "Your Honor, you said you don't care if the defendant is the President of the United States. Well, you're about to find out just how wrong you can be about someone." He turned to look directly at Mr. Patterson, who was still standing quietly at the defendant's table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "allow me to introduce you to the man this judge has been mocking for the past 10 minutes. Judge Reynolds opened her mouth to stop him, but something in the Admiral's tone made her hesitate. "The man standing at that table," Admiral Mitchell continued, "is not just any retiree with too much time on his hands. He is not just another person trying to get out of a parking ticket." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone was staring at Mr. Patterson, who stood exactly as he had before, calm, dignified, and quiet. Admiral Mitchell took a deep breath and prepared to reveal the truth that would change everything. The courtroom was so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Admiral Mitchell stood tall and proud, looking directly at Judge Reynolds as he prepared to reveal the truth about the man she had been mocking. "Your Honor," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice strong and clear, "the man you have been insulting and dismissing is Captain James Patterson, United States Navy, retired, but that title doesn't begin to tell you who he really is." Judge Reynolds felt her mouth go dry, but Admiral Mitchell was just getting started. "Captain Patterson served his country for 35 years, the Admiral continued. "He commanded nuclear submarines during some of the most dangerous missions in our nation's history. During the Cold War, he spent months underwater, protecting American interests while risking his life every single day." Mr. Patterson remained perfectly still, but those who were watching closely could see a slight flush of embarrassment on his face. He had never been comfortable with praise or attention, even when it was well-deserved. "But that's not all," Admiral Mitchell went on. "Captain Patterson was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a classified mission that I still can't talk about in public. What I can tell you is that his actions saved the lives of hundreds of American servicemen and prevented an international incident that could have started a war." The people in the courtroom were staring openly now. Some of them had their mouths hanging open. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, was looking back and forth between Mr. Patterson and the Admiral, like she was watching a tennis match. Judge Reynolds tried to interrupt. "Admiral, I'm not finished, Your Honor," Admiral Mitchell said firmly. Captain Patterson also received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. He served in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and in operations that most people will never know about because they're still classified. Mr. Patterson finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "Admiral Mitchell, please. This isn't necessary." "Oh, but it is necessary, Jim," Admiral Mitchell replied, using his friend's first name, "because this judge needs to understand exactly who she's been talking to." Judge Reynolds was starting to realize that she had made a terrible mistake. But Admiral Mitchell wasn't done destroying her assumptions. "After Captain Patterson retired from active duty," he continued, "did he sit around complaining about parking tickets? No. He spent 10 years working with veterans who were struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. He helped dozens of former soldiers and sailors get back on their feet and find purpose in their lives again." The Admiral paused to let that sink in, then continued. He also volunteered at homeless shelters, worked with inner-city youth programs, and donated more money to military charities than most people make in a year. And he did all of this quietly, without any publicity or recognition, because that's the kind of man he is. Judge Reynolds was looking pale now. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of her error. But Admiral Mitchell still had more to reveal. Captain Patterson received the Presidential Unit Citation, the Navy Unit Commendation, and the Meritorious Service Medal, he said. He was personally decorated by 3 different presidents for his service to his country. The courtroom was so silent that when someone in the back row shifted in their seat, it sounded like thunder. But perhaps most importantly, Admiral Mitchell continued, Captain Patterson is the kind of man who would never use any of these honors to get special treatment. He came to this court today not as a decorated war hero, but as a citizen who believed he had been treated unfairly. He was willing to stand here and be insulted rather than reveal who he was because he believes that everyone should be equal under the law. Mr. Patterson looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Your Honor, Admiral Mitchell said, his voice taking on a harder edge, you said that Captain Patterson probably thinks he's above the law and that the world owes him something. Let me tell you what the world actually owes him. Judge Reynolds wanted to disappear into her chair, but she couldn't look away from the Admiral's stern gaze. The world owes Captain Patterson the freedom you enjoy every day. The world owes him the peace that allows you to sleep safely in your bed at night. The world owes him the liberty that lets you sit in that judge's chair and speak your mind without fear. The Admiral's words were hitting Judge Reynolds like physical blows. Every word he spoke made her feel smaller and more ashamed. And what does Captain Patterson ask for in return for his decades of service and sacrifice? Admiral Mitchell asked. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except maybe for a parking meter to work properly, and for people to listen when he presents evidence instead of mocking him. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor, was frantically flipping through papers in her file. She had suddenly realized that she needed to take this case much more seriously than she had planned. Your Honor, she said quietly, I'd like to request a brief recess to review the evidence Mr. Patterson has provided. But Judge Reynolds was too shocked to respond immediately. She was staring at Mr. Patterson with a completely different expression than she had worn just minutes before. Admiral Mitchell could see that his words were having the intended effect, but he had one more thing to say. Captain Patterson never told you any of this because he doesn't think his service should get him special treatment, he said. But Your Honor, with all due respect, there's a difference between special treatment and basic respect. And the man standing at that table has earned more respect than almost anyone in this courtroom will ever understand. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Judge Reynolds sat frozen behind her bench, trying to process what she had just learned. Mr. Patterson stood quietly at the defendant's table, probably wishing he could be anywhere else in the world. Finally, Judge Reynolds found her voice, though it was much quieter and more uncertain than it had been before. Captain Patterson, she said, the title sounding strange in her mouth after what she had been saying earlier. I think we need to take a closer look at your evidence. The courtroom remained tense as Judge Reynolds tried to recover from the shocking revelation about the man she had been insulting. She cleared her throat several times before speaking again, her earlier confidence completely gone. Captain Patterson, she said, stumbling slightly over his military title, would you please approach the bench with your evidence? Mr. Patterson walked forward slowly, carrying a manila folder that contained his photographs and documents. His movements were precise and measured, the way someone moves when they've spent decades in the military. Admiral Mitchell sat back down, but he kept his eyes fixed on the judge. He wanted to make sure she understood that the entire courtroom was now watching how she treated a genuine American hero. Judge Reynolds opened the folder and began looking through the photographs. Her face grew more troubled with each image she examined. The pictures clearly showed a parking meter with a cracked display, and wires hanging loose from the back panel. These photographs show significant damage to the meter, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Yes, Your Honor, Captain Patterson replied. The display was completely dark, and there were exposed wires that suggested the internal mechanism was not functioning properly. Judge Reynolds turned to the next document in the folder. It was a formal maintenance request form from the city's parking authority, dated 2 weeks before Captain Patterson received his ticket. This shows that the meter had been reported as broken? She asked, Yes, Your Honor. I obtained that through a public records request. As you can see, 3 different people had reported that the meter was not working properly. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, looked like she wanted to disappear under her table. She realized now that she should have reviewed the defendant's evidence much more carefully before coming to court. Judge Reynolds continued reading through the documents. There were emails between city maintenance workers discussing the broken meter, work orders that had been filed but not completed, and even a letter from a city councilman asking why the meter hadn't been fixed yet. Captain Patterson, Judge Reynolds said, her voice much more respectful than before. This evidence clearly shows that the parking meter was malfunctioning and that the city was aware of the problem. Yes, Your Honor. That's exactly what I tried to explain earlier. The judge winced at the reminder of how she had treated him before Admiral Mitchell revealed his identity. Your Honor, Sarah Chen stood up reluctantly. In light of this evidence, the city would like to withdraw the citation. But Judge Reynolds wasn't ready to let this end so simply. She had made a serious error in judgment, and she knew that everyone in the courtroom had witnessed it. Ms. Chen, she said, before we dismiss this case, I want to address something more important than a parking ticket. She turned to face Captain Patterson directly. Captain Patterson, I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior toward you today was completely inappropriate. I made assumptions about you based on nothing more than your appearance and the fact that you were contesting a parking ticket. Captain Patterson nodded slightly but said nothing. He wasn't the type of man to make someone grovel, even when they deserved it. I accused you of thinking you were above the law, Judge Reynolds continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to confront her mistake. In reality, you came to this court because you believe in the law. You believe that government equipment should work properly and that citizens should be treated fairly. The people in the courtroom were listening intently. Most of them had never seen a judge apologize to anyone, especially so publicly and thoroughly. I also said that you probably thought the world owed you something, she went on. Admiral Mitchell has made it clear that if anyone is owed something, it's you. And yet you came here today not asking for special treatment, but simply asking for justice. Captain Patterson finally spoke. Your Honor, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we handle them afterward. His gracious response only made Judge Reynolds feel worse about how she had treated him. Captain Patterson, your case has taught me something important about making assumptions about people, she said. I pride myself on being fair and impartial, but today I was neither. I let my frustration with other cases affect how I treated you, and that was wrong. She paused and looked around the courtroom. I want everyone here to understand something, she announced. This man served his country with distinction for 35 years. He risked his life countless times to protect our freedom, and when he came to my courtroom seeking justice, I mocked him and dismissed him. Admiral Mitchell nodded approvingly. The judge was doing the right thing now, even though it was too late to undo the damage she had caused. Captain Patterson, Judge Reynolds said, not only am I dismissing your citation, but I'm directing the city to immediately inspect every parking meter in the downtown area to ensure they're working properly. Sarah Chen looked surprised. That was going to cost the city a lot of money, but she wasn't about to argue with the judge at this point. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, I'm going to recommend that the city establish a better process for handling complaints about malfunctioning equipment. Citizens shouldn't have to go through what you went through just to get a fair hearing. Captain Patterson seemed genuinely pleased by this last point. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about making the system work better for everyone. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Judge Reynolds stood up from her bench, which was unusual in the middle of proceedings. Captain Patterson, would you allow me to shake your hand? She asked. He walked toward the bench and she came down to meet him halfway. When they shook hands, the entire courtroom could see that this was more than just a polite gesture. It was a judge acknowledging that she had been completely wrong about someone and asking for forgiveness. Thank you for your service, she said quietly, so that only he could hear. Thank you for listening, he replied. But the impact of this case was about to extend far beyond the courtroom walls. Word about what happened in Judge Reynolds's courtroom spread quickly through the courthouse and then throughout the city. By the end of the day, the local newspaper had picked up the story. By the next morning, it was being talked about on radio stations across the state. The story had everything people loved: a humble hero, an arrogant judge who learned a hard lesson, and a reminder that you never know who you're talking to. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about how veterans were treated and how people in positions of power sometimes forgot to show basic respect. Judge Reynolds arrived at work the next day to find her office filled with flowers, letters, and phone messages. Most of them were positive, praising her for admitting her mistake and apologizing to Captain Patterson. But some were critical, questioning whether she was fit to serve as a judge if she could so badly misjudge someone's character. She read every letter and listened to every message. She knew she deserved both the praise for doing the right thing and the criticism for making such a serious error in the first place. Meanwhile, Captain Patterson was dealing with attention he had never wanted. Reporters were calling his home asking for interviews. Veterans organizations wanted him to speak at their events. People were calling him a hero all over again, which made him deeply uncomfortable. Admiral Mitchell stopped by Patterson's house that evening to check on his friend. "I hope you're not angry with me for speaking up," Admiral Mitchell said as they sat on Patterson's back porch, drinking coffee. "No, Bob," Patterson replied. "I understand why you did it. But you know how I feel about all this attention. I know you do. But Jim, sometimes people need to be reminded of what real service looks like. That judge learned something important yesterday, and so did everyone else in that courtroom." Patterson sipped his coffee and looked out at his small, neat backyard. He had never been comfortable with praise, even when it was well-deserved. "The thing is," he said after a while, "I didn't fight that parking ticket because I wanted recognition. I fought it because it was wrong. If that meter was broken, then other people probably got unfair tickets too." Admiral Mitchell smiled. "That's exactly why I had to speak up. You were more concerned about fairness for everyone than about how you were being treated." The next week, the city followed through on Judge Reynolds' order to inspect all the downtown parking meters. They found that 12 of them were malfunctioning in various ways. Some had broken displays, others had timing mechanisms that were running fast or slow, and one had been giving people tickets even when they had paid. The city not only fixed all the broken meters but also refunded money to everyone who had received tickets from them in the previous 6 months. The total cost was over $50,000, but the mayor said it was the right thing to do. Judge Reynolds used the incident as a learning experience. She started a new practice in her courtroom of actually listening to people's evidence before making judgments about their cases. She also began speaking to law students about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of how they looked or what kind of case they were presenting. "That day changed how I approach my job," she would tell the students. "I realized that I had started thinking of people as cases rather than as human beings. Captain Patterson reminded me that everyone who comes into my courtroom deserves to be heard." The story also had an impact on how the city handled complaints about government equipment. They established a new system where people could report broken meters online, and maintenance crews were required to respond within 24 hours. They also put up signs next to any meter that was out of order, so people wouldn't get tickets while it was being repaired. Captain Patterson received hundreds of letters from veterans and active-duty military personnel who had been inspired by his story. Many of them shared their own experiences of being dismissed or disrespected by people who didn't know about their service. One letter particularly moved him. It was from a young Marine who had been struggling with depression after returning from overseas. The Marine wrote that reading about Captain Patterson's dignity in the face of disrespect had reminded him that his service meant something, even when other people didn't recognize it. Patterson wrote back to every single letter he received, just as he had always done. He never considered himself special, but he understood that sometimes people needed to hear from someone who had been through similar experiences. The incident also brought Admiral Mitchell and Captain Patterson closer together. They had served together years ago but had lost touch after retirement. The courtroom confrontation reminded them both of the bonds they had formed during their military service. "You know what I learned from all this?" Admiral Mitchell said during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "What's that?" "I learned that heroes don't always look like heroes. They don't always announce themselves or demand recognition. Sometimes they just quietly do the right thing, even when it's difficult." Patterson laughed. "Bob, you're getting sentimental in your old age." "Maybe I am. But I'm also right. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the media attention died down, which suited Captain Patterson perfectly. He went back to his quiet life of volunteering and helping other veterans. But the impact of what had happened in that courtroom continued to ripple outward. Judge Reynolds became known as one of the fairest judges in the city. The new parking meter inspection system prevented hundreds of unfair tickets, and Captain Patterson's example of quiet dignity inspired countless people who heard his story. But perhaps the most important change was in how people thought about making assumptions about others. The story became a reminder that everyone has a story, and that respect should be given freely, not earned through titles or recognition. 6 months after the incident in the courtroom, Judge Reynolds received an invitation that would complete the circle of learning that had begun with Captain Patterson's parking ticket case. The invitation was to speak at the annual Veterans Day ceremony at the naval base outside the city. The organizers wanted her to talk about the importance of recognizing veterans in civilian life and treating all people with dignity and respect. At first, she wasn't sure she should accept. She worried that people might think she was trying to get publicity from the incident or make herself look good, but after thinking about it carefully, she decided that she had a responsibility to share what she had learned. The ceremony was held on a crisp November morning. Hundreds of veterans, active duty military personnel, and their families gathered in the base's main auditorium. Judge Reynolds sat on the stage next to Admiral Mitchell and several other distinguished speakers. When it was her turn to speak, she walked to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. Many of them were young sailors and soldiers who reminded her of what Captain Patterson must have looked like when he first entered military service. 6 months ago, she began, I made one of the worst mistakes of my career as a judge. I disrespected a veteran in my courtroom because I made assumptions about who he was based on his appearance and the fact that he was contesting a parking ticket. The audience listened quietly as she told the story of Captain Patterson's case, her inappropriate behavior, and Admiral Mitchell's intervention. I learned that day that respect isn't something people have to earn by proving their worth to me, she continued. Respect is something that should be given freely to everyone, especially to those who have served our country. She paused and looked directly at some of the younger service members in the audience. But I also learned something else that's equally important. Captain Patterson could have ended my disrespectful treatment at any time by simply telling me who he was. He could have mentioned his decorations, his years of service, or his heroic actions. But he didn't. Judge Reynolds walked out from behind the podium to get closer to her audience. He didn't use his military service as a shield against disrespect because he believed that everyone deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their background. He came to my courtroom not as a decorated war hero, but as a citizen seeking justice. The audience was completely focused on her words. That's the mark of true character, she said. Captain Patterson taught me that real heroes don't demand special treatment. They simply expect the same fairness and respect that should be available to everyone. After the ceremony, many people came up to thank Judge Reynolds for her speech. But the conversation that meant the most to her was with a young Navy petty officer who had been in the audience. Ma'am, the sailor said, I wanted to thank you for what you said today. I'm getting out of the Navy next month, and I've been worried about how people will treat me in civilian life. Judge Reynolds could see the concern in the young man's eyes. Your story about Captain Patterson helps me understand that I shouldn't expect special treatment just because I served, he continued. But it also gives me hope that there are people like you who have learned to see veterans as individuals, not just stereotypes. This conversation stayed with Judge Reynolds long after the ceremony ended. She realized that her mistake with Captain Patterson had actually created an opportunity to educate others about respect and fairness. Over the following months, she was invited to speak at law schools, judicial conferences, and community events. Her message was always the same. Everyone deserves respect, and those in positions of authority have a special responsibility to treat people fairly. Captain Patterson continued his quiet life of service, but he did accept one special invitation. The local veterans organization asked him to help train their volunteers who worked with newly returned service members. His job was to teach them about the transition from military to civilian life. The hardest part, he would tell the volunteers, isn't learning to live without the structure of military life. The hardest part is feeling like your service doesn't matter to the people around you. He would then tell them about his experience in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, not to complain about how he was treated, but to illustrate how people sometimes make assumptions about veterans. The judge wasn't a bad person, he would explain. She just didn't understand what she was looking at. Most people don't. They see an older man in regular clothes and assume he's just another person with a complaint. They don't see the years of service, the sacrifices, or the commitment to something bigger than themselves. 1 year after the parking ticket incident, Judge Reynolds and Captain Patterson were both invited to speak at a national conference on judicial reform. The conference organizers had heard about their story and wanted them to discuss how one case had changed both of their perspectives on justice and respect. Standing together on the stage, they represented something powerful, the possibility of learning from our mistakes and growing as human beings. Captain Patterson taught me that justice isn't just about following the law. Judge Reynolds told the audience of judges and lawyers, it's about treating people with the dignity they deserve while we're following the law. Captain Patterson, still uncomfortable with public speaking, but committed to the message, added his own perspective. Judge Reynolds taught me that admitting mistakes takes real courage, he said. She could have doubled down on her position or tried to minimize what happened. Instead, she acknowledged her error and used it as an opportunity to become better at her job. Their story became part of the training curriculum for new judges in several states. Law schools began using it as a case study in judicial ethics and the importance of approaching each case with an open mind. The broken parking meter that started it all was eventually replaced, but the city kept a small plaque near the spot where it had stood. The plaque read, "In memory of the importance of listening before judging and treating everyone with respect." Admiral Mitchell remained friends with both Judge Reynolds and Captain Patterson, often joking that he had accidentally become a matchmaker between a judge and justice. But perhaps the most important legacy of the incident was the ripple effect it had on everyday interactions throughout the city. People began to think twice before making assumptions about others. Teachers treated struggling students with more patience. Store clerks were more respectful to customers who seemed difficult. Police officers took extra time to listen to people's concerns. The story of the judge who didn't know who she was mocking became more than just an interesting anecdote. It became a reminder that every person has a story worth hearing, and that respect costs nothing but can change everything. Years later, when Judge Reynolds retired from the bench, her farewell ceremony was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her commitment to fairness and respect. Captain Patterson was there, of course, sitting quietly in the back row as he preferred. In her retirement speech, Judge Reynolds said, "I learned more about being a judge from one parking ticket case than I did in 15 years on the bench. I learned that justice isn't just about being right. It's about being fair, respectful, and humble enough to admit when you're wrong." Captain Patterson never sought recognition for the role he played in changing how one judge approached her job, but those who knew the story understood that his quiet dignity in the face of disrespect had taught an important lesson about character, service, and the true meaning of heroism. The broken parking meter had been fixed, the unfair ticket had been dismissed, and justice had been served. But more importantly, two people had learned something valuable about respect, humility, and the possibility of redemption, and through them, countless others had learned the same lessons. In the end, the story wasn't really about a parking ticket at all. It was about the power of treating every person with dignity, the courage to admit our mistakes, and the quiet heroism of those who serve others without expecting recognition in return.